This is Tommy's Outdoors 66. How are you people? I hope you are all doing great. This episode of the podcast is the one I wanted to record for quite a while. We all heard the phrase, hunting is conservation, and hunters are quite keen and quite often claim conservation. But in fairness, hunting is not always conservation. However, there is probably no better example where hunting is conservation than Africa, African wildlife conservation and trophy hunting. So the most obvious way to do that podcast would be to bring you a professional hunter who would tell you all how hunting is conservation. But I think I have something much more interesting in this episode, because our guest is Professor Adam Hart, biologist, author, and broadcaster, who has a keen interest in wildlife conservation, who been to Africa, who's seen things with his own eyes, how they look like on the ground. And on top of that, he is not advocating for hunting. He is not advocate for hobby or sport like hunting. He is interested in conservation, evidence-based conservation. Most of the time on the podcast, we spend discussing complexity of conservation, hunting, and interaction between wildlife and people and politics and all these aspects. And we also specifically discuss situation of elephants in Botswana. As you might be aware, last year Botswana started selling trophy hunting packages for elephants. And obviously that is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for bucket list hunting holidays. But it's not that simple as many think. It's not a matter of, oh, we have too many elephants, so let's send some guys with copper solids and we sort out the problem. It's much more complex and much more difficult to solve. Obviously, the subject is so complex and so interesting that we could spend hours and hours talking about it, and obviously we did not have that much time. So perhaps we will hear from Professor Adam Hart on the podcast again. And for now, ladies and gentlemen, African wildlife conservation with Adam Hart, just after this short message. I want to ask you a favor. To help me with the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating on the app or the website where you are listening to me right now. And if you want to go the extra mile and help me even more, leave a review. And now, please enjoy this episode of Tommy's Outdoors. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I must say I'm following your Twitter page for some time, and I'm really impressed. It seems like you're always on Twitter. How are you doing that? You have like a lot of people who are behind the scenes are controlling that. Or is it all you?
No, it's all me. I must confess, at times I feel a bit like I'm addicted to Twitter. I find it a really useful way of getting information. Actually, it kind of, particularly for sort of science these days, it's so hard to keep on top of things that if you follow a few key kind of people, they're always kind of dribbling out the information to you that you need to look for. I do give myself some time out though. I have sort of I usually do at least one day a week where I'm not on Twitter, but sometimes I break if I see stuff coming through.
I agree. It's a fantastic tool if you know how to use it. For people who don't know, it's at Adam Hart Science. So I would thoroughly recommend that. And obviously I'm following a lot of discussion around conservation and hunting and stuff like that. And this is how I come across your page on Twitter. Before we go there, I often get labeled as a proponent or advocate for trophy hunting lobby.
Yes, I find it quite interesting, really. I'm not a proponent or an advocate for anyone, really. My sort of journey into this, I'm interested in conservation science, but I'm also interested in the kind of complexities of of the real world. And from the first time I visited Africa for the first time about 20 years ago, and very quickly realized that it was not this romantic ideal that I'd built up from watching David Attenborough documentaries since I was 3 years old. It was a very different place, and actually the realities of conservation. I came from a very sort of protectionist background for conservation. You put a fence around it and you stop people from going in, and you keep everything like it is. And I suddenly realized that actually that wasn't really going to wash for a lot of the world. So it was a real wake-up call. I mean, I was doing a PhD at the time, actually in social insects. So I was looking at bees and wasp behavior, ant behavior. But I was very much invested in biology. I did an undergraduate degree at Cambridge. I studied conservation ecology, and yet I hadn't come across any of these kind of ideas before. So it was a real wake-up call to realize that the world was slightly different. And the biggest of that was understanding that hunting was actually used as a form of conservation in some of these areas. And I have to say, when I first came across that, I was stunned. I was shocked. I think I was appalled to a certain extent. Because I didn't understand, but I was in Zambia. I was actually staying on a property that did hunting, and they very patiently and very thoroughly actually explained to me exactly what was going on, and it was really clear to me. I mean, they said to me, "Look, you've driven here. Yeah, how much wildlife have you seen?" And I said, in Malawi we saw some monkeys and a hippo, and on the road to this particular property, I'd seen no wildlife at all. I'd seen lots of goats and cows, and they said, "Yeah, that's exactly right, because that land use is more valuable than wildlife." But here on their property, wildlife had a value, and that value was because people wanted to come and hunt it, and that's when I suddenly realised that people weren't just hunting for meat. So they weren't going out and killing something just for the freezer. They were taking the meat. By the way, there's this myth in trophy hunting that they just shoot stuff and leave it on the bush. It's not nonsense. Anyone that's been to Africa knows what a ridiculous prospect that is. So they were taking the meat, but they were also taking the horns or taking the skin, and in some cases wanting to measure those horns officially. They were official measurers, and to get in the book, which I realized was found was the Roland Ward book or SCI's book, and that was just I opened up this whole new kind of avenue of things. But all the way through this was, of course, money. It was the money that they were bringing, and that money meant that land was being used better. It had a better profit for wildlife than it did for cattle. And if that wasn't the case, they would have converted to cattle. But as it was, they had this huge property. I mean, we talk about a lot of these areas that we're talking about in Africa, actually, particularly in South Africa, but in other areas, are kind of fenced areas. And I think people think that animals are sort of running around, and people down there will call them farms. And I think people don't realize that we're talking about areas the size of sort of English counties in some cases. One of the famous areas in Zimbabwe, the Boubier Valley Conservancy, is the size of Luxembourg. Collectively, and I think this is something that people don't understand either, the amount of land that's actually protected, because that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with protection of habitat that's protected through conservation hunting, trophy hunting. It is about 1.3 million square miles. It's a huge area. It's bigger than France, across the whole of southern Africa. We're talking about Botswana now, Namibia. That doesn't include South Africa, which is a slightly different sort of situation we can talk about, but Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, and Tanzania, and actually also I would say not coincidentally also the areas that are doing best in terms of sort of megafauna conservation. So it's a very big issue. But yeah, when I first came across it, it was something of a shock.
And this is something that I noticed many times, that obviously, number one, people find kind of counterintuitive that how hunting is conservation.
Yes.
And to be honest, in especially in Europe, sometimes I feel like hunters claiming conservation a little bit too fast, and this is what I was saying as well.
Yes.
For example, as I'm based in Ireland, and I said on the podcast I think a few times that I am really struggling to say that, this is conservation what we're doing in terms of hunting. There can be some argument made, but not like 100%. But I think that Africa and what's going on in Africa is really like a example, because on one end, this is really the role that hunting plays in Africa is really significant. It's not like some licensing fee or something like that. It's like you said, this is protection of the massive amounts of land and protection of the habitat on one end. And then on the other hand, because it's so charismatic and so iconic, the African animals, right? Like
Yeah.
even like if you ask again, I'm kind of going to repeat myself from the previous episodes of the podcast, but even if you ask kids in England or Ireland, name the animal, they're gonna go like zebra or elephant, right?
Yeah.
They're not gonna go woodcock or whatever else, hare or So now and then it's like, oh, you're killing those poor animals. How this is conservation? And one of the thing that I heard, like you said, I can't recall now the source, but there's like 22% more land is protected by trophy hunting concessions than all the national parks combined. Now, I don't know if it's entire Africa or one of the countries, but it gives a sense of scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of Africa, it's a good deal more. Just in South Africa alone, the amount of land that's protected underneath sort of conservation hunting is about 3 times the size of national parks. I mean, the Kruger National Park is a huge transfrontier national park in South Africa. It's about 2 million hectares. And the amount of land in private hands, which is used for hunting, is about 20 million hectares. So, these are huge undertakings. But you're absolutely right. It's not sufficient just to claim conservation benefits. Those need to be evidenced. And I think what people often don't understand is that there is a huge body of evidence. This isn't something that people haven't studied. It's actually been studied a great deal. And part of the reason, I think, for confusion is that obviously those studies throw up different findings sometimes. So we had a study this last week that looked at cougar hunting in North America, which showed that actually really it doesn't seem to have a conservation benefit. It's not causing a problem, but the only benefit seems to be to sport hunters. Now people will jump on that and say, hunting is wrong. Well, no, actually, for a population of cougar in the Californian mountains, hunting has neutral effects. You can't then say what will happen in other populations or in other species on other continents, and that is one of the big problems. But what we can say, and I haven't had anyone manage to successfully argue against this, is that in countries like Namibia, for example, and South Africa, parts of Tanzania, that hunting does not protect that habitat, because the reality is it gives value to it, but it involves local people within that conservation, because people live in Africa. There's this notion that Africa is a kind of unspoilt wilderness, and it isn't. People have lived there for a very long time. Indeed, our species evolved there. Africa has a much older history than the history that we often think of. It goes back thousands of years with empires and sophisticated cultures that lived there. So, this notion that we're somehow in Africa as a sort of aberrance is completely wrong. People have been part of this habitat, and they still are. And those people need to have an income too. People want to develop. Now, you develop as a nation based on the resources at your disposal. Now, the great shame about Africa is that it has a huge number of resources which are far more valuable, actually, than wildlife. So mining, for example, there are an enormous mineral deposits. That's been really a curse for Africa because of overseas exploitation of them. But that's the reality. There's a huge amount of resources. Now, if we internationally want wildlife, and I believe that we do, and I think we're right to think of it as our international heritage, we have to accept that the alternatives to having wildlife running on land is to have that land developed for some other thing. It might be for agriculture, it might be for strip mining, it might be for hydrodynamic projects to provide energy. There are lots of other competing land uses. So if we want wildlife to be there, we have to give it value. And currently, certainly according to an international report, an independent report that came out recently, of all of the forms of community conservation that give land value, there is nothing currently that measures up to trophy hunting and ecotourism where it works. But that report was very careful to couch the fact that ecotourism is not a panacea. Ecotourism is wonderful when it works. It's terrible when it doesn't work for the people and the wildlife and the habitat. And it can't work everywhere. So we're not going to come up with a one-size-fits-all. There's not going to be this magic solution whereby we can do one thing and it protects all that habitat. What we need is tools at our disposal. And even though some people find it morally repugnant, hunting is one of the tools that is currently working. And one of the things that I'm sort of counseling people against is this notion of calling for immediate and massive bans. And lots of people would like that right away. They'd like it to be banned tomorrow. Well, I would actually like it to end too, for more complex reasons. But we can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. That land will find other uses. We've seen it in Tanzania actually after the Cecil the Lion sort of debacle, which we can talk about as well. What the Americans did was to ban the import of lions, even though they're actually allowed under different things, and it wasn't seen as a problem at the time. So what happened was that made some of that land in Tanzania less valuable for wildlife, and some of the concessions that came up weren't bid on. And at least one of those concessions, which was about 12,000 square miles, I believe, was rezoned as development land. So this is what we see. I mean, I've seen it in South Africa. You can see, if you're on a wildlife reserve that's using hunting and in some cases tourism as well, and you look next door that isn't doing that, what you'll see, generally speaking, is a very big difference in habitat. The next door property will be running goats and cattle. It'll have very, very depauperate grassland. It generally will have very low biodiversity. It's usually got what's called bush encroachment, so you get an awful lot of effectively monocultural kind of acacia scrub growing through. It really changes the dynamics and the structure of that environment and makes it much less biodiverse. And you can see this. It doesn't. This isn't. I think a lot of people think that all this is kind of pie in the sky hypotheticals. I mean, you can see this happening all the time. You can see it happening outside my house in the UK. That was farmland. It was a beautiful view. There's now a small housing estate on there for the very simple reason that land has greater value as a housing estate than it does as farmland. So it gets converted, and what we see is this erosion and attrition of the natural world, and hunting is a way to try and stop that. But the reason why I would like to see it stopped, phased out, is not for a moral reason. I don't morally object to the activity. It's not for a conservation reason. I can't find a single species that's currently under a conservation threat from trophy hunting, and neither can lots of other people. And believe me, we've looked, and I'm very open to anyone coming up with examples. I would love to know them. The reason why I would like to see it phased out is I don't believe it's sustainable in the long term in terms of the number of people that will be doing it. In 50 to 100 years' time, I'm not sure that we will have a culture and society that will have much hunting left. We're already seeing hunting phased out. Europeans, certainly some countries, hunt. The UK actually has an increasing number of people that are involved in hunting deer, for example, and things. But I don't think that over the next 50 to 100 years that we're going to see this sort of persevering. And so we need to look for solutions.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I cannot not agree with you on that we see hunter recruitments, it's going down, and perhaps I have a problem to say like, well, let's all go hunting for conservation reasons. That sounds right. But anyway, listen, I just want to, you touched briefly on the ecotourism and safaris and all that, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit on this, because like when I see what I see is number one, the hunters are usually much more happy for going somewhere in the bush and be in the rough conditions, while in the ecotourism I see 5-star hotels, and then I see like a train of Land Rovers or Land Cruisers stuffed with people, and the wildlife kind of circles around them, and when I look at it I say, well, that's not the wildlife. Those animals are barely wild. They're so accustomed to people and cars, and this kind of doesn't look to me right. So while the hunter who goes through the bushes and they have trackers and they have all that in much more preserves the habitat and actual wildness of those wild animals. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would, from both from academic and personal experience. So you're absolutely right. One of the issues of ecotourism is that generally speaking, tourists require a level of luxury. They demand it. And in fact, particularly in countries where perhaps their overseas currency is quite strong, there is almost that sense that you can live like a king, and people want that. And it's actually quite hard to find accommodation when you go to places in Africa that aren't quite lavish or right the way down at the other end.
Yeah.
It can be quite difficult. So that's the first step. And of course, those luxury lodges and so on require infrastructure to support them, which has a huge potential carbon footprint, but also an ecological footprint. And long term, I mean, I've seen accommodation going up in Piedensberg National Park, for example, that's involved quite a long term building project by the back of one of the lodges over the last couple of years. Now, I've seen elephant, lion, hyena, rhino in that area. They're not there anymore. They've been scared off. So these sorts of disturbances are not small. On top of that, comparing, you're absolutely right, hunters don't require that. They might like it, and some lodges, there's all kinds of, we can't generalize here, it's such a huge undertaking, and there are luxury hunting lodges, of course, but there's also a much more basic experience. But the main thing is that they're paying much more per person to be there. So
Yes.
the sort of, if you like, the disturbance level is virtually minimal, because you've got one or two people compared to hundreds, and they're paying to be there, and they're using much less in terms of infrastructure and carbon and so on when they are there. So their impact overall is far less. Tourists do disturb wildlife, and there's an increasing number of studies looking at, for example, the reduction in cheetah productivity when they're exposed to tourism, nesting birds and so on. You can see all of these things actually with your own eyes. You're absolutely right. You go to any of these places, you can see the influence. I've seen lion hunts disturbed by tourists. I've seen a leopard hunt disturbed by people trying to get too close. I've seen people getting their feet run over. I've seen people engaging with elephants in ways that are life-threatening as a consequence of wanting to get a better photo. I've seen people get out of safari vehicles in the presence of dangerous animals. Really idiotic behavior. People driving around with their windows open in lion country. All of those sorts of things. So there are all kinds of issues with ecotourism that are often overlooked. It definitely has. It definitely has that kind of impact. The other thing that's quite interesting is when you sit in a tourist place, one of the big topics of conversation is how little they've paid. Everyone is in this kind of spiral of getting a good deal. So a trophy hunter might pay, everyone wants a good deal, but a trophy hunter might pay 50,000. I saw an elephant hunt being advertised this morning in Botswana for $37,000. That didn't include, I believe, a number of fees. Whereas you'll find tourists saying, "Oh yeah, we got this place for a week for $400." There's people are always looking to screw the price down. So that's an issue. The other issue is, tourism is a great source of employment. However, when you go to many of these tourist places, what you'll find is a great deal of the higher end jobs are being, if it's owned internationally, and many of the places are, they're often sort of staffed by people from Europe. Not even sort of citizens of that country. So that's not uncommon. But the employment that is mainly offered in tourist concessions is cleaning, gardening, carrying bags. Whereas in hunting areas, you'll be using people's skills that they've developed over a lifetime. And when you follow trackers, or you see, if you see an expert skinner at work, it is a thing to watch. When you see someone that knows what they're doing, breaking a carcass down and keeping the skin so that it can be tanned and used, it is phenomenal to watch. And when you watch a tracker actually track a specific animal, find an animal and track it through heavy bush, potentially for hours, and tell you about that animal, and when you come across it, they already know where it's going to be. When you really have that experience with someone that knows wildlife, it is very, very clear that sort of person should be doing that, and they shouldn't be gardening or some other opportunity that's given to them.
Exactly.
And it's an interesting thing. If we look across the sort of piece in Africa, for example, Kenya banned all hunting in the late 70s, largely under pressure actually from Western NGOs, but they were also having issues with elephant ivory poaching, and they thought that they could control some of that. It began a tourist industry that now brings in over $1 billion a year. They've seen their wildlife decline by 70% during that time, and there's lots of issues. There's a demographic bubble, for example. There's massive increase in all sorts of things. There's been some political instability and so on. But in all of those analyses, the fact that local people cannot benefit from wildlife has always come out.
Yes,
Um,
the value is negative. The value of the wildlife
yeah,
for them is negative because
it's exactly.
the elephant destroys crops or whatever is happening, and they rather see it dead
Yeah.
than be there.
And so, animals get snared, they get retribution poisoning, retaliatory poisoning, preemptive poisoning, which is actually one of the biggest threats to lions right now. And we get
Mhm.
habitat loss because that land becomes
Yeah.
more valuable doing other things. Botswana had hunting, was one of the premier hunting sort of destinations up until 2014 when a moratorium on hunting was put
Hmm.
in place. Now, during that period, up until very recently when that moratorium was lifted, some of the concessions which were available, you could bid on them. You could run an ecotourist concession there. They didn't get
Hmm.
taken up. And we saw a loss of income for those people. I mean, one village I heard of lost $600,000 a year. That was paying for all of their facilities and schools and pensions and everything. That went. And we saw lots of problems. And as a consequence, and I know there are all kinds of political machinations that go on, and nothing's as straightforward as it seems. But as a consequence of that, politically, the current government were voted in and did a consultation, which seems to have been done correctly, and they've reinstated it. That's
Yeah.
that's interesting. And actually, there was a little bit of a some people were saying, oh, they're selling elephants now. We want to bid on the elephants so that they don't get killed and hunted. And they kind of weren't allowed to by the government. And there's all kinds of people saying, well, they've been blocked and, this isn't right.
Yeah.
The reality, of course, is that those tourist concessions were open for the last 5 years. And many, those organizations haven't stepped in. What we
Yes.
find is a lot of people who talk the talk, but when it comes down to it, what we need is money on the ground to safeguard that habitat. And currently, in many places, it is hunters, whether we like it or not, that are supplying that. And that's, I think, what concerns me and a lot of other scientists too. This isn't a minority viewpoint. This is the viewpoint of the IUCN. This isn't me going out on a limb. This is actually being quite centrist, really,
Yeah.
and sensible. Is that we are going to be in trouble if we don't find alternative ways to keep that land safe from other uses, and we don't find ways to work with people in those areas and to work
Or
with government.
increase the number of hunters.
Well,
Get
this
more
this
hunters.
is
Get more people hunting.
yeah, this is another thing. Start to develop new areas, which I don't think anyone is seeing as a potential way forward. But yeah, I mean, if people start wanting to do it, of course, you were right earlier to say, you can't suddenly have everyone in the world hunting, but equally, with the sort of money that's involved, you wouldn't. I mean,
Yeah.
my sort of argument. I mean, I spoke to Craig Packer about this. So he's the kind of world expert on lions, and I
Mhm.
interviewed him about hunting, and he was very clear about it that he finds it abhorrent, but he absolutely sees the value of it, and that
Yeah.
well-regulated trophy hunting can be an important tool in safeguarding habitats, and that is not a threat to lions. That was his considered response. But his argument was, make the buggers pay. You shouldn't be able to go to Africa and shoot a lion for $15,000, $20,000. It should cost you $500,000. If
Mhm.
you want to shoot an elephant, brilliant. $1 million. That's how much it's going to cost you. And when you see, I mean, I don't follow these things very, very closely, but I know some of the tags for bighorn sheep in the Rocky Mountains. I believe they can be sold for 500,000 or more.
Yeah,
I
it's
do.
so-called governor's tag. I think but
Yeah,
that's like a one or two tags. But the other thing is that you're waiting 30, 40 years
to get one. Yeah,
they have all the system, very complex system of preference points, and if you're
right.
putting every year and you're not gonna get drawn, then you have like preference points, and so people are accumulating those preference points, and then you see rather older people going hunting, and they say like, well, yeah, I was putting for that tag for the past 40 years or 30 years, and
Right.
here I am, while I still can, even
Yes.
go to the mountains to so exactly, that's exactly right. Listen, Adam, you mentioned Botswana, and this is like there's a lot of talk recently because
Yes.
all poor elephants. They're gonna sell elephants. They're gonna kill elephants. All that talk. Um, but I think that the situation, and I don't know if I've got it right, but the situation is specific in Botswana because it's not like, and you're gonna correct me if I'm wrong in a second. It's not a situation where you have a massive wildlife wilderness area protected and you have an elephants and now they open those elephants to hunting. The problem is that those elephants are kind of like intermingled, for the want of a better word, with local people, with local population, and there's a deadly situation when you have this happening, and they're trying to mitigate that situation with lowering the number of elephants that are living essentially in the same area where people do. But then, yeah, maybe I'm gonna stop here and let you tell me whether that's right or whether I got it wrong.
Yeah, okay, so you're right. There's lots of different types of areas within Botswana. So some of the areas are national parks. People aren't hunting in national parks, but around the national parks, and actually far exceeding in terms of land volume the national parks, you've got areas which are put aside for concessions. So you can buy the rights to hunt there if you like, and you can set up properties there, and ecotourism. Obviously, we're talking about the Okavango Delta, so quite a lot of these areas are running tourist operations. But there's only so much. It's not like ecotourists are a massive, unlimited resource. There's only so many people that can go down there, and some of those areas are also running hunting, and they've been able to bid into these parcels of elephants. So about 270, I believe, were put on trophy, as they would say, and they're being sold off in packages, which have raised lots of money. We were talking, millions of dollars collectively over the course of those auctions. Now, Botswana has a very interesting situation when it comes to elephants. It has a standing population of around 130,000. That's the sort of the number that you can guarantee are there. At certain times of the year, obviously, elephants don't take any notice of international borders, so they slip across. There's a very large sort of frontier area between a number of countries up around in Botswana and surrounding areas. So at any given point, I've seen numbers as high as 250,000. Now, when you talk to various different people, so those numbers are pretty much undisputed, right? They have, well over 130,000 elephants at most times. They don't have a carrying capacity for that many elephants. Now, carrying capacity is a problematic term, and it can be difficult to estimate. However, when you look at different estimates of how many elephants, if you like, the environment can support, those estimates are frequently somewhere between 30 and 50,000 are numbers that you can find. So, you can find any number you can stand over, but we're sort of broadly speaking, those are the figures. Regardless of the exact value of what you decide those numbers are, we have a population that far exceeds any published sensible carrying capacity that I've seen. And you can see that evidence. So I was in Botswana back in November around the southeast part of the Okavango Delta, and you can clearly see where elephants have moved through. They've converted the area into a sort of lunar landscape. The trees have all been pushed over. There's very clear signs everywhere. It doesn't come across in photographs. It really comes across in the landscape itself. Now, elephants are very important at doing that. Elephants are ecological engineers. They structure habitats. Pushing over trees is part of what they do, yes. However, when you have very large numbers of them doing it in concentrated areas, because they're not able to move over the landscape like they used to, because we're there and we've built roads and so on, you can end up with a problem. So first of all, you do have some physical problems. Now, there are all sorts of arguments. So people say, oh, well, down by the Chobe River, that's a natural process. Okay, but up here it's not. You can argue the ins and outs of it, but I don't think anyone can argue the fact that they are causing some ecological damage in certain places. And on top of that, you're absolutely right, as well as crop damage and crop raiding, they are killing people. I believe, I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear that pings that are going off.
No.
Oh, cool. That's my computer. So on top of that, they're causing crop damage, but they're also killing people. And I saw figures last year, I think, of 34 people. It may have been 37. They were disputed, actually. A number of animal rights charities have disputed those publicly, but they've disputed them by saying, "Oh, they only killed 17," which I find quite a. Okay, well, how many people is an acceptable number of people? So you have a population that is sort of threatened, if you like, by elephants. And I interviewed people around the Pilanesberg National Park in South Africa with the idea of getting them to say, it was a kind of manipulative interview, really. I wanted them to say that they were scared of lions because it fitted the story we were telling. They're not scared of lions. They're scared of elephants. Because elephants are huge. I've been on the ground, close to an elephant that was kicking off. It was quite, I was with someone that knew what they were doing, and it was kind of mock charging, and I knew all that, but nonetheless, it was still pretty scary. I've been on vehicles with, elephants a bit too close or whatever, and you kind of, you're not sure what to do, and you feel that sort of, it's not. They're big, they're huge.
Yeah.
The idea of sitting in a hut somewhere with a group of elephants moving through effectively my back garden, knowing that in some cases they've killed people or trampled people or whatever, that is that is a day-to-day reality for people that live in areas where there are elephants.
I always wondering, people who are so opposed to hunting or so opposed, have these really radical views of like, stop hunting now and so on and so forth. What would they say if they were actually, because in fairness, they usually living comfortable lives, and the most wildlife they see is a rat. And how would they feel if they were in the active danger of being trampled by elephants? I guess their point of view would change radically and
Change
quick.
probably very swiftly, along with, of course, living with predators.
Yeah,
And the real danger to people from lions. I mean, obviously they do attack people, but they also attack cattle. And when cattle
yeah.
are your wealth, then that is a big problem. So yeah, so what Botswana did when they reopened the hunting was to allow some elephant hunting. Now, elephant hunting in any sensible numbers and in any numbers which would be even remotely feasible is not going to reduce the population. You could, I mean, in principle, do it, but it's never going to happen. The very small numbers that they put on trophy really are to supply income to those areas, in a sense, an appeasement, right? Okay, there's elephants here, but look, you can get some value from them, to provide development for those areas. There's also some other ideas that potentially hunting elephants in certain areas makes them shy of people, so it moves them into other places. Trying to shift wildlife around a tricky environment with lots of different land uses and already problematic in terms of migratory corridors and things is risky. And I've seen people, suggest that might be a problem. It might well be. Nothing is perfect. Nothing is going to work out brilliantly. Some people say we should just leave them alone. Well, that's very easy for us to say. I think a lot of people think that nature will find a balance. Well, it will do, but we've put roads across the place, and we've changed some of it to farmland and things. Very often, the balance that nature will find is not the balance that we want. We have already manipulated the natural world in many of these places, so we have to accept that. It is problematic. So
I
Botswana.
feel it's almost like a accepting responsibility for what we've done, and now for the wildlife.
Yes.
I think it's like, oh, just leave it alone, and well, nature will find a solution, and that solution may involve a mountains of corpses,
Yes.
of wildlife and human alike. So it's kind of like a responsibility that I feel like we should take.
Yeah, we have altered the landscape in many places, and we need to accept responsibility. You're absolutely right, and to manage that. So that's what Botswana is attempting to do, and the reality is they do it very well. A recent survey of the conservation of the world's megafauna and efforts and stuff had Botswana number one, head and shoulders above, actually, well, Namibia. In fact, 4 out of the top 5 nations were countries that have hunting as an integral part of their conservation strategy. So they do very well, but they've come under a lot of pressure, and that pressure, of course, comes from people who object to hunting. And we can't, it's the elephant in the room, I suppose. A lot of people fundamentally, and they would say morally, object to hunting, and they will say it's morally wrong. Now, my argument to that is that is your morality, not everybody else's. I personally think lots of things are right and wrong and whatever, but I don't seek to enforce them on other people. I don't believe that, but I've had conversations with people who genuinely do. I had a conversation just last week with someone who basically said there is no difference between killing an animal and killing a human being. Now, that's not a
Wow.
perspective that I have any ability really to intellectualize or take on board, because
Yeah, he's probably slapping mosquitoes all day long.
yeah, but the reality, of course, is that I haven't perhaps thought through. Why do I, for example, think that it's immoral to kill a human being, which I do, but not immoral to kill an animal? Okay, well, what I'm suggesting is that maybe there is some form of universal morality. We would all agree that it's wrong to kill someone. So therefore, should we not then, will our sense of morals evolve over the next few hundred years, and we'll end up with a different perspective on animals? That is all very well and good and great for philosophical conversations, and certainly very valid conversations to have. But right now, that's not going to save wildlife, unfortunately. And I think what many people believe is that loving animals is somehow magically going to save them. And what they don't understand, and what lots of people don't, and what I'm increasingly realizing is that many political people that make decisions don't understand either, is that loving these animals will do nothing whatsoever for their conservation, and we will end up with a situation where we erode habitat further and further. The reality is they're not going to go extinct. Elephants and lions in national parks and things, they're going to be protected. What we're going to end up with is an impoverished, depauperate world where we don't find wildlife outside of those heavily protected areas. And you can right now, right? You can drive through. We were keeping a birding list as we were going through Botswana and Namibia back in November, and you find wildlife and birds and habitat outside of those areas when you drive through some of the wildlife conservancies, which are not fenced and not marked, but people live in there and they gain some benefit from them. We stayed on a farm in Namibia, very interesting property actually. It was a cattle farm. It's huge, but it ran cattle for some of it, but actually it also had a huge amount of wildlife, and they'd set up a hunting business there, which meant that the wildlife they had there now had a huge value. And they had giraffe. I mean, they had everything: blue wildebeest, black wildebeest, both types. Giraffe. They had mountain zebra there, because the animals that were living there were being encouraged. They built water holes for them. They didn't have large predators in terms of lions, although they did occasionally find their way in there. But they had leopards, they had cheetah on site, they had hyenas. Now, hyenas are generally persecuted by people that farm cattle, but they weren't there because they happened to have a number of clients who wanted to hunt hyena. And so those hyena had quite a high value for them. So they were being encouraged, actually. Caracal they had there, again, an animal that was ruthlessly persecuted by many livestock herders, the type of cat, kind of like an African lynx. But again, they were there in good numbers, and the bird life was phenomenal. Now, if that area, and this is an absolute reality, if they, and I asked them this question, if you could not get the money that you get from hunting, if hunting suddenly stopped and you weren't allowed to export trophies, to Europe or to America, people didn't want to come to hunt anymore because they couldn't do that, or it was being made to be unattractive or even illegal, what would happen? And the guy just looked at me and he said, well, we'd eat some of the wildlife for meat and we'd convert some of the land for cattle. He said, and slowly but very surely, and probably not that slowly, the wildlife would have no place here. He said, and he goes, and that's not something that he wants. He says, but the reality is, he has 22 families that live on that property who he is financially responsible for. And that's an awful lot of people, that he's responsible for. He has his own family too. Now they got some money from tourists. That's why we were there. We were staying in their tourist part of it, but it's not sustainable with tourism alone, and it's not sustainable, interestingly, with hunting alone. Actually, the two work very nicely together with farming to keep that huge area working. And if you remove hunting, it won't. And it's as simple as that. It's not that they'll. People go, oh, we can just replace it with money. Okay, well, first of all, you've got to find that money. But what are you going to do? Go around every single patch of land across the world? Because we're talking about Southern Africa, but actually this model is the North American species model. I think something like 60% of statewide funding comes from hunting revenue. It's found in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, where it looks after markhor and things. The Nunavut up in Canada. Inuit communities that hunt muskox and polar bear. I mean, we're talking of large, huge areas. You're not going to wave a magic wand and suddenly come up with a single solution. So, that's my concern, is that I don't think people really understand the complexity and scale of what they're dealing with. They don't understand that simple solutions always in ecology come up with unintended consequences, that we know already a great deal about those unintended consequences from other natural and unnatural, human interventions, if you like. And we need to treat this in a much more mature way than seeing something that we don't like and perhaps don't understand and screaming that it needs to be banned. It's
Exactly.
not as simple as that.
Exactly. It's a little bit like it wasn't me, but someone said, like, the approach is like, I love elephants and I don't want anything bad happen to any single elephant. Full stop.
And I'm with that, right? I love elephants too.
Yeah, but you obviously you have like a broader view and you see much bigger picture. Listen, Adam. So going back for 1 second to Botswana, the interesting thing you mentioned, and this is something I picked up again from various interactions on Twitter, is that really opening trophy hunting in Botswana is not aimed at lowering the population of elephants. That there's nowhere near, we have nowhere near enough hunters or interest in shooting elephants significantly lower the number that would be required to to lower that number.
Yeah.
So what's how does that look like? Does it are we talking about like a massive call of the elephants, or what's?
I mean, you've got to hope not. Certainly, elephants have been culled in the past. In fact, I spoke to someone not that long ago who was involved in a cull in Zimbabwe, and
Mhm.
it's a nightmarish situation. Culling is nearly always shows a problem, right? That to let something get it's never your desired end result.
Yeah.
Culling of elephants. I mean, just to describe what happened in Zimbabwe at one point. So it's a very specialist operation that goes on. It involves vehicles, lots of people with guns, which is very dangerous. Um, this guy was actually he rode on the back of a Land Rover with a shotgun. He
Gee.
actually he wasn't shooting elephants with a shot. Well, he was actually, but he was herding them. So they were involved in grouping the elephants together because when you cull elephants, it has to be done. You cull at herd level. So you
Mhm.
don't remove individuals, you basically cull the whole lot out. He said, that they made a plan. This is what we're going to do. He said, as soon as anyone goes in there, the whole thing just falls apart. There's just, elephants falling over everywhere. There's people shooting everywhere. People died. People have
Yeah.
died doing this. In fact, the guy that took over his position apparently died a week later.
Oh God.
So I mean, it's an awful prospect. So I see people occasionally go, "Oh, we'll cull them all," in a very gung ho way. I very much doubt any of those people have ever spoken to or been involved with it.
Mhm.
I don't really want to speak to that guy again about it. It's quite it's kind of an unpleasant thing to be hearing about. But
Yeah.
it's a big thing to cull a population down to any level that would be close would be just beyond barbaric. It's not going to happen, right? That's the reality. You
It's
could
it's
argue, of
it's
course,
horrific.
that
You
it
said like
should.
that they were using like a military ammunition, so it's like a fairly small caliber, right? Like
Yeah,
uh,
they were culling them with F and FAL, so like R1, so like a battle rifle.
that's it's not a humane kill of an elephant. I
Well,
mean, like
I mean, so the equivalent civilian cartridge would be a 308. So
mhm.
that's kind of what you would use for deer and sort of smaller things. I mean,
Yeah.
it's yeah. When people hunt elephants, sort of trophy hunting elephants, they're typically using sort of calibers that begin with a 4, so
Mhm.
larger. But I mean, yeah, it's an interesting one because actually, I asked him about this, and he said, yeah, it's really about placement. They were sort of going for headshots and things, but like he said, all of this stuff, it all sounds great, but the reality when the shit hits the fan is that it doesn't go down that way at all. And he was describing all kinds of incidents which were just
Mhm.
not just not to be repeated, really. And and,
Exactly.
and we and we don't see that level of culling. They did cull in South Africa, I believe, in Kruger for a little bit, but yeah, it's not. Yeah, there would be international outcry. The level of culling that would be required to be sensible. There's no point in doing this unless you're going to do it to a level that's sensible, and there would be huge amounts of problems trying to set what would be a sensible level, even before you look at the mechanics of it. And bearing in mind, once those elephants go down, that is meat. So there'll be meat processing factories set up in the bush. This guy said they were followed by trucks, like giant flatbed trucks with sort of butchery sort of departments in them, basically trying to get the meat. It's hot, so of course you've got to process them quickly. The skins, the hides are also taken. It just sounded, yeah. I mean, if there's a YouTube video actually called the Great Buffalo Hunt in Australia, I think if you just Google Great Buffalo Hunt Australia, it comes up with it. They had a big problem with water buffalo, like
Yes.
non-native species in Australia, and they took the decision to cull a lot of them out. And this video is like an hour-long documentary about it. And again, you can see the sort of level that's going on. It's rapid fire. There's lots of animals going down.
Oh.
They're followed on with this big butchery kind of big flatbed butchery trucks. They're loaded on conveyor belts. The whole thing is sort of mechanized slaughter. It's not ideal, but they felt they had to do that because of the ecological damage that they were causing. So,
Yeah.
yeah, the situation in Botswana with their elephant numbers, they've got huge numbers of elephants. You can make all kinds of arguments for, there's too many and so on. But the hunting that's been set up is in no way looking to address that number. It simply wouldn't be feasible to do that.
And that's important to say that, because and even I was at the beginning of the impression that this is what it's aimed to do, and then find out that no, it's not going to happen. So then what is the solution for Botswana? And I think that the interesting was local people saying that they want to hunt that. And you know what, I it's like a really penny dropped, because even you mentioned the trackers, right? It's a tracker who does the hunting. It's not a PH. It's damn sure not a
Yeah,
paying
the
a
client. Yeah.
lot of money in client. It's a tracker who does the hunting. And I think it was that the conversation around that, oh, actually, if you're hunting animals, their human conflict, animal human conflict will increase, because those animals have nowhere to go. So you have a situation when you have a lot of people living with elephants, or you have a situation when you're living with a lot of people living with bunch of pissed elephants. So which one is worse? And then that conversation about, oh, why don't local hunts, right, well, hunt, because they know, like you mentioned, they have that thing dialed in. They know how to hunt elephants, and they are doing that using poisoned arrows. It's much more quieter. Those elephants are not apparently so upset about it. They don't know really what happens, and so on. Is that the solution for Botswana, to open up hunting for locals, and let them to deal with the situation in some way?
Yeah, I mean, potentially. So, yeah, and you're right. Well, I mean, one of the other issues of elephant hunting, particularly taking individuals out, is that herd dynamics can change. Local knowledge is held within sort of matriarchal societies of elephants. They have very complex social lives, very sensitive social lives, and removing individuals from them can cause all sorts of problems. Hunting an elephant is no small thing, in no sort of sense of the word, and lots of people would make very valid arguments. I think that they can be all kinds of knock-on effects. This is not none of this is ideal, right? This isn't a conversation that we want to be having, and it's not a conversation we want to be having in 50 years' time or 100 years' time. But you're right. The idea of local people having sort of dominion, if you like, over those animals, and doing things is a model that we see in northern Canada. So in Nunavut, which is an Inuit nation, effectively in northern Canada, they have a polar bear quota, which is very rigidly sort of defined, very carefully defined, and that polar bear quota is given to local people, and they can, if they wish, pass some of that quota on and make use of it through trophy hunting, if you like, through foreign hunters coming in, and they can decide what to do with that. They can decide how many they go through. I think there's a limit to how many sort of tags they can offer, if you like, but there's some regulation involved. But it works for them, and actually polar bears are doing well in those areas. So that is potentially a model that Botswana could use. There's no reason, I suppose, why they couldn't. But Botswana is very much finding its feet with this at the moment. This is the first sort of quota of elephants coming through. There's been pronouncements from the Botswanan government actually just last weekend, saying, look, we haven't done this lightly. This is a big decision. But we're doing it for these reasons. This is the consultation. And within that was actually a very interesting statement, which I'll paraphrase now, which was basically, we've received lots of letters from overseas NGOs, interfering with this process, not acting in the best interest of wildlife or the area here. And, they had the opportunity to bid for these areas when it was a tourist concession only, and they didn't. And, so basically, I mean, the sort of subtext is basically, so butt out is really the subtext. We see similar things coming through from Namibia as well. Kind of basically, we know what we're doing, and what you're doing is interfering. That particularly was the case when an elephant called Vortrekker was, well, called Vortrekker. Elephants aren't called anything. They may be called something in their world, but tourist guides come up with names for particularly charismatic animals that they can find easily, which builds up a nice rapport for the sorts of visitors that want to go and see animals with a name. Personally, I don't. I hate the fact that I see, I follow various parks that I've been to, and I see animals pinged up, and they go, "Oh, this is such and such." No, it's not. That's I really don't like that approach.
Do you feel like it's taking from its wildness?
Yes, yeah, I absolutely do. I absolutely do. But so these sorts of so that animal was killed actually, as was hunted legally and completely above board and everything else. else, but it became a big story. And actually, the Namibian sort of government then released a statement that effectively said, this has been fanned up. The flames have been fanned by 3 NGOs. They didn't name them, although I could, you can very easily find the names of the individuals involved actually, and that they've done it. They effectively said that they've done it for donor harvesting. That they've done it to raise attention and to get money, and that this doesn't help conservation and things. So what we're starting to see now is these kind of quite you can sort of sense the sort of frustration and also kind of an anger from some of these countries of you're going to stand thousands of miles away and tell us how to manage our wildlife when you don't have any wildlife around. And I forget, I don't know,
Exactly.
I think it was Eisenhower who said farming is very easy when your plow is a pen and you're 1,000 miles from the cornfield, and in a sense
yes.
that is this kind of vibe. And so it's interesting to see how it'll happen. But obviously, this has come to a fore to a certain extent, or come to a head to a certain extent, because of the consultation that we've had here in the UK on trophy hunting, which had various options from sort of complete ban to doing nothing. Lots of organisations pushing for that option 3, the complete ban. I don't know what their plan. I don't know how they believe that's going to work. A complete ban on imports here in the UK wouldn't necessarily have a huge effect in the short term, potentially in some of these areas, although it would have an effect. Of course, the knock-on effect is that it starts to begin, this process of banning. The argument would be, you need to come up with solutions. But of course, a flip side of that argument, and it's not an invalid one, is, well, you have to make the start somewhere. So maybe, putting a line in the sand will encourage people to come up with other solutions. My argument against that really is that there are plenty of people working desperately to come up with other solutions at the moment. Should we be tying the hands of the people that are doing this? But let's not pretend for a moment that this, none of this is ideal. This isn't a conversation that we should be having. If we went to another planet, this isn't how we would manage it. It's not how we might necessarily like to be managing things in 200 or 300 years time, or even 50 years time, just based on sort of dynamics and hunter recruitment and so on. We do need to come up with more mature ways. But my argument would be, well, if the UK feel that way, rather than tying the hands of people doing the conservation that we want them to do, we should be leading the charge to find better ways, and ways plural, because we're talking about a very complex landscape, lots of species, different populations, different human populations, cultures, history, politics. We can't broad brush paint Africa, as we tend to one like it's one place. We can't treat these species like they're one thing either, because we're actually dealing with populations. So some lion populations, for example, are increasing in areas where they're hunted. Other lion populations are decreasing. Some lion populations are hunted, some aren't. There are issues even within very small geographical areas in terms of how things are regulated. This is complicated stuff, and it's sort of become shorthand now to, well, ban trophy hunting, African wildlife. We use these horribly broad terms which remove all that complexity and make the problem seem really simple, and the problem is really complex.
Exactly.
And we know with all ecological situations that simple solutions to complex problems end up with unintended consequences. Whether it's cane toads in Australia, or banning hunting in Kenya, or even things like, for example, changes in land law in Kenya, for instance, suddenly allowed people to start selling off portions of land, and so they started fencing that land, and that fencing has now been in-fenced. And we have areas where, for example, the Maasai or the Mara National Park, where the large wildebeest and other antelope migrations go through, is now being threatened as a consequence of fencing. Now that is an unintended consequence. There was a ban on polar bears, polar bear importation of polar bear trophies, if you like. From Canada. The US put that in. It was part of their Endangered Species Act and things, lots of fanfare. That made no difference whatsoever to the number of polar bears that were being killed, because, of course, it didn't change the quota. It just meant that the people in the areas where they had that harvest quota weren't able to sell any of that to overseas hunters, which meant that they lost out financially, which made them less engaged with the conservation process and made those polar bears overall less valuable to them. So there were unintended consequences of that. but I would specify unintended but not unpredictable.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
the problem. Yeah, we didn't mean it for it to happen, but we kind of knew it would, and that's really the problem for me with this sort of this ban situation. We kind of know what's going to happen if we start seeing more and more bans because we've already seen it happen. So it is frustrating, but equally, I really do get. I do, and I don't think I sort of always put this across very well, but I do completely understand people's outrage and sense of outrage when they first come across this, or even when they've looked at it in some depth. I get that. I do. I had that when I first came across it, and I still get it now when I look at pictures of people, holding up lions' heads and grinning and stuff. I still feel. I feel that too, but it's not enough. We need to look at the bigger picture, and we need to be more mature about it, and we do need to look for alternative ways.
Exactly. How do you think it's going to end up with the current consultations about the trophy hunt? Like
I
a
mean,
prediction, if you had to make a prediction.
well, look, the reality is an awful lot of people have been motivated to either fill in the extremely convoluted and quite problematic form, in my opinion, or email to support option 3, a complete ban. All of the rhetoric in the UK media has been to support a ban. I've seen nothing balanced in the UK media over the last couple of months, really, and I've seen an awful lot. Let's be quite plain about it: misinformation. In some cases, I think we could legitimately call it fake news. So the consultation will be overwhelmingly inundated, I'm sure, with people to ban it. I also know that a number of lots of people and organisations and countries have submitted sort of evidence and statements to say that actually it's fine the way it is and we don't need to do anything. The reality, of course, is that the government will see this as an easy win. We are in difficult times politically. We've got Brexit running through. We now have coronavirus causing issues. The idea that you could get these front page news most weeks, some sort of hunting story, right? The idea that the government can do something which will be perceived as good, I think, will be irresistible to them. They will be personal. I mean, it's the soon-to-be wife of the prime minister is one of the key voices calling for a ban. We can't pretend that these things don't all play a part. It will be seen as politically useful. So I think there will be some form of sort of government action over it. I doubt it will be a complete ban. My suspicion will be that it will be a tightening of regulations, or that countries that want to import to the UK will have to prove that hunting is causing conservation benefits. And in some respects, actually, that wouldn't be a bad thing. Greater regulation and monitoring, better evidencing of conservation, all of those things. So yeah, I suspect that that's what will happen. I very much doubt that a complete ban will be the end of it, just because of potential implication. But who knows? I believe the
it's an
US
important
are going
point.
through a similar thing as well. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. But it's the role of evidence and sort of balanced views in making these decisions, which I think is also an issue that we need to consider.
It's a good point that you made, that to some extent having those countries to provide stronger evidence, it might be good, because I don't think that anyone wants to pretend that all hunting is good and all hunting benefits conservation, and right. So it actually might be beneficial. I heard about a company who are doing like a 3D prints of trophies, so you can actually go to Africa or whatever, or even like you mentioned with the polar bears, where they kind of scan the animal and they reproduce in the 3D prints, very very realistic, whether it's a bone trophy, or even like with a fur and everything else. So it's like
Yeah.
a kind of very close copy that you can have if you happen to live in a country that bans that, or if you're a hunted animal that it can be imported.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting as well, because actually what people think that they're voting for, I think, certainly looking at some of the comments on Twitter, is a ban on trophy hunting. What they don't really realize is that they're actually looking at a ban on importing trophies to the UK. I can see a situation, like, let's imagine that you want to go trophy hunting. you want to go to Africa, say, and you want to shoot a kudu, right, a spiral horned antelope or an impala or something. Now you might think, okay, I'm not that rich, and actually most people, a lot of people that do this aren't millionaires. Maybe you look down through the prices. Now currently the expectation is that you will shoot that animal, you'll be on site for a certain amount of time. All of those fees are kind of fixed, but then there'll be a trophy fee that will involve preparing that trophy, skinning the animal, taxidermy, packaging, shipping, all the paperwork. That adds quite a lot onto your package. Now, at the moment, that may well put people off. I can imagine a situation where they go, okay, look, we've got this like Brits deal, we don't expect you to do that because we know you can't. So you can come and do all this, and suddenly you've got a cheaper price. It's not inconceivable that cheaper price might encourage more people to hunt, because suddenly they don't have the expectation of bringing that trophy back. And for many people, let's be quite real about this. Every time I go out for a walk, I come back with a trophy. I'm looking at my shelves in front of me now, and I've got an old deer antler that I found, and I've got a bit of broken bird egg and stuff. For many people, that is it is a memento of an experience. It is not the reason necessarily. Some people, yes, it is. They have their trophy rooms and whatever. For a lot of people, it's just they went out for a hunting experience. They probably ate most. They certainly would have had the fillets off a good antelope and things. Because that's part of the experience as well. And then they will have been able to bring something back and have it as a memory, if you like.
Yeah.
So, but it is not the be all and end all for many people. But it is part of the expense. So, that kind of dynamic, I think could be an interesting proposal. But the reality, of course, is that UK is a relatively small player in this. I've heard 2% figures. I mean, I've never seen too many data around it, but we are not one of the major players within the economics of trophy hunting. That's the United States and certain European nations. So
in China, I heard that China as well
increasingly. So interestingly, and of course that can link into other issues as well, including potentially laundering elephant ivory or rhino horn through trophy hunting, which we've seen, by the way, in the latter case with Vietnamese trophy hunters in South Africa a decade ago now. So people would come, sham trophy hunters. They would come because the rules, you can't sell or export rhino horn. That's been illegal, but you can take a rhino trophy back for personal use. And so the idea is that businessmen would go out, that basically rhino syndicates would go out and hunt, bring it back as a trophy, and then it would just disappear. That's been sort of clamped down on now. But there's all kinds of unintended consequences again of these sorts of bans. The rhino horn trade within South Africa was banned in 2009, I think, and that coincides with the beginning of the current poaching onslaught. And many people will point to that and say, this is what's happened as a consequence of that ban. Many other people say that that's not true. None of this stuff is straightforward, but I can see, I could see the potential for actually an expansion of the market. I mean, it's not a ridiculous thing, but who knows how it will all pan out. But one thing that is very clear is that there will still be trophy hunting going on next year, regardless of what the British government say. And there may well be more consultations, and there may be more international consultations. I know American governments are thinking about sort of tightening up and things. And this is an activity that is going to be under continual and increasing threat. And that is a problem not for the activity. I couldn't care less if people weren't able to do this tomorrow. It will be a big problem for the habitat it currently protects, and that is that is why many of us are concerned about it. I'm not. You said at the beginning about being an advocate or proponent of it. I'm not. I have no skin in this game at all. I'm not in the employ, I'll never have been, of any organisation other than the university that employs me. I'm not interested in this as a pursuit. To get involved with trophy hunting, first of all, you have to have the inclination to do it, which I don't. But secondly, you have to have time and money. And I've got a fairly large young family, and I'm an academic. I don't have any. I don't tick any of the boxes to do this. This isn't something that's personally.
You don't have 120,000 pounds lying around to go and shoot a big tusker.
Exactly, and 3 weeks to spare to sort of disappear. This is about looking at things in the round and understanding that there is a role for this in conservation, and that we need to be careful with how we proceed with this. We need to be careful. We can't. But you're right. You said earlier, there is a need for countries and for areas to say, look, this is the benefit that this brings. Here we go. What we don't hear actually is enough of those stories. What we're hearing generally is an awful lot of noise from one side, about banning it, often really not backed up with anything. I say to people, show me the species that are a conservation concern, and they'll all say, giraffe, no, that's not true. Lion, no. Elephant, no. Rhino, quite the opposite. White rhino increased in numbers as a consequence of it. There is that aspect of it, but then they will come down to they find it morally repugnant. Okay, I get that. The flip side is often scientists saying, oh, but here are the facts and figures, here's this, here's that. What's missing quite frequently in those debates are the voices of the people on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons for that are complex. In some cases, because those people are too busy doing what they do. In many cases, because we don't go out and get their point of view. They're not on Twitter. They're not writing for national newspapers. They're not able to come on podcasts. We're not hearing that. And in some cases, of course, further out in the sticks, you're talking about people that, maybe don't speak English too well, or they don't want to go and do this sort of thing. We're not reaching the sort of those kind of stories that are based in the locations where these activities goes on. We don't hear from people who, for example, have had their crops trampled by elephants. We hear people telling the story. We talked about it, but we haven't heard from the people. And I think we need many more stories from these areas to talk about wildlife, to talk about the conflicts that exist, to talk about their respect for wildlife, how they love these things, right? They're part of a deep-rooted part of their culture, far more than ours. Right? But they have a different way of looking at things and a different type of problem. We don't get that. We don't sort of learn about pumps that have been put in by hunters. We don't hear about, for example, anti-poaching. Which is funded in a great many areas by money that comes from hunters. We don't hear. I mean, there's a fantastic place in Mozambique called Cutada 11, which is a huge conservation success story. They've translocated lions there. 24 lions. If you look up 24lions.org, they've repopulated the area with lions and nearly doubled their numbers, I think, in very little time. Huge numbers of antelope there now. That was a project that came about through hunting. We don't hear those stories. It's very difficult to get the press to cover them because nobody wants to be seen to support trophy hunting. Such is the sort of push against it. If you get mentioned sort of supporting trophy hunting, well, first of all, you take a lot of personal abuse, but you're normally just put down as a last sentence in an article that's basically outlined sort of how people do it. It's very difficult, and we're not hearing that diversity of voices. We're just hearing from kind of scientists saying, look, hang on, we need to be careful here, it has a role, and then loads of other people saying, well, look, it's abhorrent, we don't want to do it anymore. Both sides are guilty of simplistic preaching, and in some cases quite hectoring narratives, and I'm aware that I'm guilty of that sometimes too. And it's a much more subtle argument. It deserves better airing.
I heard that phrase, conservation colonialism.
Yes,
kind of like we're gonna tell you what to do. Leave those elephants and lions alone. Right?
Yeah.
And, I was like, oh, that's simple, right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the flip side of that is people say, well, trophy hunting itself is a very colonial activity. So this is, it all gets very complex. And it's sort of, as soon as you start bringing up that aspect of it, you start opening a whole other can of worms beyond the conservation or the science of it, or whether you want to debate the ethics and morality of it. You've then got the sort of, this kind of idea of neocolonialism, of imperialism, and so on. Cultural imperialism, racism rears its head, of course, as well. And I mean, we've seen pronouncements, I think, from the president of Botswana who called out organizations as being racist. I think a couple of years ago or a year or so ago. So we've got this kind of thing running in as well, which only serves, of course, to further confuse an already difficult area. So none of this. We've said it before. None of this is easy. None of it's desirable. This isn't where we want to be. But equally, it is where we are, and for many areas, it's working. That's the reality of it.
Fantastic, Adam. It's incredibly fantastic, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
With us and explaining all that. Is there anything else that you would like to close that podcast with?
Well, I think really the sort of message that, look, this isn't I don't think, I think of all the sort of scientists that I've spoken to about this, isn't something that any of us really want. But we understand the value of it. But if we want to get rid of it, we need to come up with more imaginative solutions, and they're going to come from all kinds of different areas. Um, things that people haven't even thought of yet, or things that people have thought of that can be scaled up. But it's going to require a diversity of approaches, and we need to start thinking of the world in a much more sophisticated way. So I would just say that that's what we need to be putting our energies towards, not getting increasingly upset and angry about specific things or specific activities, but trying to fix those problems, trying to come up with a way to develop and bring people up in terms of their level of development in ways that live in harmony with what's left of the natural world, and allow for there to be wildlife and natural spaces outside of heavily protected, fortress conservation style, national parks and so on, where people are effectively excluded. That's what we need to be turning our attention to, and it's not too late to do that. And if we don't like conservation hunting as a solution, if we don't like ecotourism, or we understand that it's not applicable everywhere else, we are going to need to find other things. And that's really, I think what we should be spending more of our energies doing.
Absolutely. Adam, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.